Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our Talking Story session. Those of you who have joined us before, you know that Talking Story is a thing that we do in Hawaii a lot. We just sit around with each other and just to get to know each other and build our relationship. It's a way of building intimacy between people. And so talking story for us in our culture is really, really important. And so this particular series we're doing for the church, we're inviting persons of color to join us on these talking story sessions. And we want to learn from them about their passion and why they do what they do and how they got into what they're doing, particularly as it relates to social justice and racial justice. And so if you can, if you're watching us, obviously you're online, and we hope that you'll watch some of the other interviews that we've done. This morning, I'm actually joined by Pastor Jamie Polson. She'll be co-hosting with me today. She and our speaker are very good friends, and I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Jamie and have her introduce our guest this morning.
Well, today I have the pleasure of welcoming Reverend Sandhya. Many of you may know her already. She has done numerous retreats at our church on anti-racism for both staff and for our community. I've also had the joy of knowing her since the early 2000s when we met at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Reverend Sandhya does many different things in the community. She is a pastor. She is a writer. If you go onto Amazon and look her up or any other website, you will find her work on different things, transforming your community, many things on anti-racism. And also today we're going to have her share a little bit of one of her newest books, Liberating Love, which is a devotional. I think most importantly, in addition to her community organizing, being a pastor, her work as a consultant to many churches and organizations on anti-racism is the heart with which she does it. She comes from a place of deep love and a commitment to every single person being honored in God's image as the foundation for her work. So we are so happy you're here today, and we have many, many questions for you and look forward to learning from you and helping our community learn too.
I'm so grateful to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Great. So Sandhya, I've always begun these interviews by asking our guests, in light of the pandemic, it's been quite a year and a half. And so how's your spirit these days? How's your soul doing these days?
You know, about 6 months, maybe even a year ago, I started saying there's two groups of people right now. There's people dealing with mental health issues, and there's people who are in denial of the fact that they have mental health issues. I think the reality, and I'm not meaning to make light of it, I think the reality is we've all gone through a collective trauma. And I think that we haven't figured out how to be gentle with ourselves. And so we haven't figured out how to be gentle with each other. I work with a lot of folks who are really frustrated with the fact that people on their teams at work or in their faith communities are being unreasonably demanding, are being, all of these things. And part of what's going on is people don't realize we're feeling things more deeply. We don't have very many reserves. We might not be engaging people with the best of ourselves. And so I've been watching a lot of faith communities, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of even corporate spaces where there's a growing tension because we haven't figured out how to metabolize what's happened to us all. We don't have the language for talking about it. So I think in that respect, I'm not any different from anybody else. On some level, I'm like, everything's normal, but it's not. And the fact that I'm trying to tell myself that and trying to act like that means I'm not always showing up as my best self either. So that was maybe a too long answer to that question, but I guess I would say, yeah, same as everybody else.
We have our highs and lows for sure. Yeah. Well, I know that in reading some of your books and getting to know you a little bit, that you have such an amazing background, such a tremendous background. And so I know that our members here at the church and would love to know more about you, more about your family, and about your rich cultural and heritage background. So could you share a little bit about that with us?
Absolutely. So my father is from West Bengal, which is a state in India, kind of on the eastern side of India. Kolkata is the biggest city there. Although he grew up in a tiny village that it takes over a day to get, well, it takes about a day to get from Kolkata to his little village of Tildanga by train. And my mother is from Scotland. She grew up halfway between Glasgow and Airdrie, but her heart is on the little island of Great Cumbria that her mother grew up on, that she spent all of her summers on. So my parents met at a college dance. And it's really the most adorable story because all the men stood on one side of the room and all the women stood on the other side of the room. And my mother said, you had a chance to decide while the guy was coming over to you whether you were going to say yes or not. But my father came around from behind my mother because he didn't know what the rules were. And that was the end of that, she said. So they were together for almost 56 years. They were married for almost 50 years. My father passed away just before their 50th anniversary, but it was one of those stories for the ages. And they dealt with a lot of discrimination. They were in Britain. They were disowned, but both of them were disowned by their families for marrying outside of their religion and race. When they tried to buy their first home together, neighbors circulated a petition because the neighbors didn't want miscegenated babies growing up in the neighborhood, miscegenated being the term for mixed race, right? For me. Although the thing that my mother always included in that story is she said, you know, the reason that we knew about that was because they successfully bought the house. And they said, the next door neighbor told us about it because he thought it was hilarious. And she wasn't complaining. She was saying, it's not just the oppression that we experienced. We also had people who took for granted that love is love, even back then. And so she's, you know, my mother was always good at, both of my parents were always good at telling the whole story. And so they did experience a lot of marginalization, and they had people who welcomed them in. And sometimes it was the same people, you know, people who were like, yeah, we should send them all back, but your dad's okay. Right. You know, so that's the complexity of this stuff in a lot of ways, that and it's the choices particularly that people of color have to make over and over, is how much of that's okay? How much of that do we live with knowing that someone's a good person and they're a little bit racist? Having to navigate that all the time is just part of the reality, right, of being a person of color.
Now, you actually came to the States as a child.
Yeah. Yeah, so we moved to Akron, Ohio, and which was a great place to grow up in a lot of ways because, you know, my mother had grown up in an industrial town. It was an industrial town. It was lots of working folks. So there were lots of ways in which that was a great experience. It is also why I learned the importance of labor unions, if I'm allowed to say that, because that was how a lot of people were able to survive and not be mistreated by, you know, by the tire industry, right? So, so that's where I came by my passion for the well-being of workers as well. Was growing up in Akron.
Your childhood was pretty interesting.
It wasn't to me. I just grew up in it.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up just outside of Akron, and so Akron was a predominantly was a predominantly Black city, but you went immediately from urban to rural, and so I actually grew up in a predominantly white community. There were 5 children of color in my class of 200, and 3 of us were mixed race. So that was part of my growing up. There was a lot of navigating by trying to fit in. I was never very good at that. I didn't realize that that was my superpower until later. once you get to the point of saying it's great that I'm not normal, you discover no one's normal. And this actually creates lots of opportunities to build relationships. But in the Midwest in the 80s, that was not how it felt, right? So yeah, I mean, I definitely have some stories. We came to the States in the late 70s, early 80s, which was a time of real tension between workers who were increasingly losing their jobs and this perceived rise of Asians, right? So Vincent Chin was beaten to death in Detroit when I was a kid. I was living in Akron, but it was the same community, same culture. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American motor worker who was beaten to death for being Japanese, which he wasn't, but he shouldn't have been beaten to death either way. So there was definitely some of this kind of anti-foreigner culture because economic conditions had become so hard for working people. And that tension was very real. And I definitely experienced a little bit of bullying when I first came to this country because of that. But I also got to experience communities that really embraced me. When my family was naturalized, my pastor, who had been an Air Force chaplain his entire career until he went to that church, he dedicated the entire children's moment to the fact that my family had gotten naturalized because it was in the Akron Beacon Journal, and he brought the newspaper in and he said, "Do you see Shonda's in this picture? And isn't it amazing that we get to be this kind of country that welcomes people from all over?" Which was, I didn't realize it was a countercultural action at the time. I just saw him being, proud to be an American, because as somebody who had dedicated his life to the US military, I thought that was the connection. It wasn't until I was an adult I realized he was training the congregation to be the kind of Americans he wanted the United States to be, and not just taking for granted that they would be. It was, he was doing some mentoring and coaching and spiritual formation in just that action. So I was really lucky in that respect too.
Shonda, one of my questions for you, because I know you well, and talking about your childhood, now I think it happens more often than not that families might have two people from different faith traditions, or a parent who's an atheist, a parent who's a Christian, a parent who is Muslim, a parent who's Jewish. Families look really differently religiously in our country now, my family included. And I'm curious about your experience growing up with both of your parents who had, different faith traditions in a time that probably that wasn't happening as much.
Well, and it was interesting because, again, growing up in the Midwest, there were a lot of, I loved Jesus. Jesus was my best friend from the time I was 3 years old, right? I've always just thought Jesus was the best. People are often surprised because I do have kind of some progressive politics. People are always surprised to hear that I'm such a passionate Christian. And I say, my relationship with the church might be complicated, but my relationship with Jesus has never been very complicated. He's always been my best friend, which meant, because that was a little unusual in the United Church of Christ that I grew up in, I ended up hanging out with a lot of evangelical friends because they understood what it meant to think Jesus was the best in that particular expressive way. And they were also people who spent a lot of time praying for my father's soul and having mixed feelings about coming over to my house because we had Hindu statues in the house, and who told me it was really sad when my grandmother had died and I should have tried to save her because now she was going to spend eternity in hell. And so all of that was kind of mixed up together in my upbringing. And I was really, and I don't know where it came from, but my mother, who was the Christian, Scottish Presbyterian, she made sure that I learned stories of Hinduism, that I learned an appreciation of Hinduism. In fact, when I would ask my father questions about various Hindu deities, he would say, "Ask your mother." And so I was raised very much going to church every Sunday. I was raised with a deep appreciation of but I was raised with a deep appreciation of Hinduism. And the same day we became naturalized as US citizens, the people behind us were from the same region of India that my father is from. And it happened to be Durga Puja, which is the biggest festival in that region. Actually, it started yesterday. So it's the entire state of West Bengal shuts down for 9-10 days straight, right? So that everyone can celebrate. And it was Durga Puja the day that it was the first day of Durga Puja, the day that we got naturalized. And the family behind us said, we're throwing a celebration for Durga Puja. And so we got connected to the Bengali Hindu community in Akron that way, and I got exposed to the festivals there, as well as for me, the very rare occasions we got to go back to India. All of our money was going back to the family. We couldn't afford to visit as often as some Indians living in this country. So I didn't start getting to go back regularly until well into adulthood, once the family there was really thriving. And so I could spend my money on airline tickets.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Shonda, you're the executive director of the Oakland Peace Center, and
I was until January 1st. I am now just a contract worker there and cheering them on. They've adopted a horizontal governance structure, so the remaining staff are actually co-running the place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
but I'm the founder.
Yeah. So could you tell us about the work of the Peace Center and how it came to be that you established it, and your work as in ministry as a Christian pastor too, and it really is an amazing organization, and it's impacted the communities and our churches. So yeah, could you tell us more about the Peace Center?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a story that Pastor Jamie knows very well, because I was living with Jamie and Zach while the church, First Christian Church of Oakland, was fixing up the caretaker's apartment in the basement of the church so that they could have a place for me. Because in 2006, when I started pastoring at First Christian Church of Oakland, it was a congregation with 10 in worship on an average Sunday in a 40,000 square foot building built in 1929. I don't off the top of my head know what your square footage is. Do you all know? If I were to guess, I would say about the same footprint as LOPC, except ours was stacked on top of itself, right? And original construction, 1929 building, original plumbing, original electric, 10 people in worship, largely because of white flight, largely because of people disinvesting in urban centers during the 70s and 80s. And in fact, the parsonage had been located in Pleasanton, because the pastor in the 70s was like, I'm not living in Oakland, which I feel like was the beginning of the end, right? And they had to sell it off to take care of the building. So when I got there in 2006, there were 10 people in worship, predominantly African-American, because those were the members who had decided to stay in the community. And we had some conversations about what it was we wanted to contribute to the neighborhood. And they named that they wanted to create the experience of peace that they got when they came to worship. It was the 1 hour of the week they were guaranteed peace in a community that dealt with more than its fair share of violence. But we didn't have a lot of energy, so we weren't going to create something from scratch. So we spent the next 3 years reaching out to the folks we admired who were doing the work of ending violence, of resisting violence in our community. And we just kept showing up and saying, what do you need from us? How can we be helpful? And after several years of showing up with the community organizations who were doing anti-violence work, we said, hey, we've got this space. We wonder if that would be useful to you. And a few years later, the Oakland Peace Center was born as a collective of then about a dozen nonprofits. At that time, 6 of whom were in the building. Now it's a network of over 40 nonprofits, about 12 of whom are in the building, who are connected to each other across a diversity of ways of doing anti-violence work. Some of them are doing organizing for people's rights. Some of them are providing food and clothing. Some of them are teaching mindfulness and meditation in jails and prisons and cancer wards. Some of them are teaching anti-bullying and trauma-informed education and mental health for children who are generally underserved. So they're coming at these issues of creating violence and creating justice, of ending violence and creating justice as pieces of one whole, kind of a patchwork quilt, lots of individual pieces, but creating this one holistic vision of peace and justice for Oakland. And the congregation still exists, and they're even smaller than when I was their pastor. And last year, the Oakland Peace Center partners reached over 150,000 people. And I don't know very many congregations that can boast that. And I think it's pretty exciting that they've proven that numbers aren't the only way that we can have spiritual power.
Thank you. Amazing. Now we know, of course, as people who, are part of organizations, it just doesn't happen overnight. Do you mind sharing a little bit of your spiritual practices and the process that went into making it possible to serve 150,000 people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do think that if there is kind of a magic solution, it was the fact that we kept showing up and asking what folks needed over and over for years before we brought any solutions of our own to the table. And so it literally was several years of consistently showing up for and serving in the ways that the folks we admired needed help, right? So we weren't assuming what they needed and providing it. We were following the platinum rule. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The platinum rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And so actually listening to what people needed, what people wanted, and responding in that way. And building trust, building relationship, because the reality is a lot of the folks that we admired who were doing great work on the front lines of ending violence, they hadn't always had great experiences of churches. They had experiences of churches showing up to do things on the church's terms or looking for a project that would make the church feel good about themselves. They didn't have experiences of really humble showing up over and over. And so you could tell they would let us do a little bit more each time because each time we were proving we were willing to do whatever they asked. Would you be willing to hang up flyers? Would you be willing to buy some tickets to the Silence the Violence A's game? Would you be willing to lend us space for this event? And then it started shifting to, would you be willing to help check people into our events so that our folks can focus on the pat downs, right? To make sure no one's bringing weapons into the concert that we're having. Would you mind tabling at the community fair, which was a bigger ask? They wouldn't have started out with that. But over the course of years, they realized, oh, you're the kind of congregation and community we would actually want our people to plug in with, right? And so it was a gradual increase of what they let us be involved in. And over time, we did a lot of listening to what their needs were, which is why several years down the road, we could say, hey, it seems like you're having to invest a lot of time raising money for the space you inhabit. Would an affordable space and a community of other folks doing the same work as you actually serve you? And we got together and the dozen or so of us did a lot of brainstorming together about what that could be. And we co-wrote the mission statement, and partners have been a part of shaping how the building is used and how our collective work functions. And so that's That was, if anything, the most important part of the spiritual work. It was the practice of humility and a service orientation and a lot of listening, which I think we forget is actually a spiritual practice.
I think that listening attentively to people really recognizes their dignity.
Yes.
So
Yes.
such an important part of the work that we try to do, I think, and but we forget that, I think, a lot. You know, we think we project on other people what we think is best for them. So.
Right.
So Sean, I want to ask you on your own website, and we'll put that up on the website for people to see. There's such an eye-catching phrase on the advertisement for your newsletter, and it says, join the joy in racial justice. Join the joy in racial justice. Can you explain that to us? I mean, how does one find joy in working toward and living into racial justice?
You know, it's funny because I do most of my work these days is anti-oppression and anti-racism consulting with corporations and nonprofits and higher education institutions and faith organizations. And it's interesting because my experience is people know it's important work to do, but they treat it like broccoli. I eat it because it's good. Now, I know we've discovered great ways to prepare broccoli. It's delicious, but you know, there's this, I'm eating it because I'm supposed to. I'm eating it, or it's maybe more like my relationship with kale. Unless it has a lot of salad dressing on it, I'm eating it because it's nutritious, not because it brings me delight, right? And I think people have that relationship, that sense of how racial justice works. Oh, it's going to be painful or it's going to be hard. I'm not doing it because it's fun, but I know it's good for me. I know it's good for the community. One of my favorite artists in the Bay Area is Fabiana Rodriguez, and she actually has designed some of the Ben and Jerry's containers, and she now has a T-shirt design at Old Navy. She's made it really big very recently. It's very exciting. I was at a presentation she gave one time, and I've never forgotten it. She said, she was talking to social justice activists, and she said, "Listen, y'all, you keep inviting people to a struggle. The movement, join the struggle for justice." And she said, "I'm on your side and I don't want to join your struggle. I want to go to a party." And I've never forgotten that. And the reality is, and we forget this, if we do the work of racial justice well, we get to bring the wholeness of who we are, every single one of us. Because you were saying, "Oh, Shonda, you have such a unique story or such a rich story." And I'm like, I guess not to me. But like, to me, Jamie has a rich story, and Gerald, you have a rich story. And like, when we do the work of racial justice well, all of us get to bring the fullness of who we are to the table, and all of us are blessed by that. It ends up, we have to do some pretty heavy work. I'm not going to deny that, but it turns out we get to experience such joy in being and experiencing each other's full, rich lives when we do that work well. And the problem is we sometimes try to skip steps and just get to that. And it's not possible because there are structures and systems that have created the barriers to us being able to be our full selves with each other, whether we're conscious of that or not. So I do a weekly newsletter where I send out a little word of encouragement to the folks who are trying to do that work in the world, to remind folks that joy is possible. There's a payoff to doing this work.
So Shonda, for people who might be new to doing this kind of work, or maybe, they started thinking, how can I really use my everyday life to be involved in both the struggle and the joy of it, looking at systems, other things like that. What would you say to people who are just beginning this process of maybe starting to read and listen to people's stories? What advice or encouragement would you give them?
Absolutely. And I think it ties back to exactly what I was talking about with First Christian Church of Oakland, spending a big chunk of time just doing a lot of listening. So there are two things I want to say about that. One of which is, not everybody's big into social media, and I understand that. I will say for myself, following Indigenous activists and Black activists and Asian American activists and Latinx activists on Twitter means I'm listening to a different conversation than I would get otherwise. I'm listening to different people than I would get to listen to otherwise. And sometimes, and disability, there's amazing disability justice activists on Twitter as well. And the reality for me is sometimes I'll read something and I'll have an automatic reaction to it, which is, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're going that far. That's ridiculous. No one's going to get on board with that. And that's the moment that it's important for me to pause and engage in the practice of curiosity. And yes, some curiosity about, I wonder why they're pushing that. But even more importantly, I wonder why I reacted like that. And so sometimes I'm reacting to, they're asking for too much. And if I pause and ask, why do I feel that way? I'll realize I've been conditioned to think that America is not capable of giving us equality. And that's why I'm reacting to these folks as being too extreme. It's because I've already trained myself to expect so little. And so engaging myself in the exercise of, I wonder why I reacted that way. If something hits me the wrong way is an important part of that practice. And so recognizing that my reaction isn't automatically correct, but it's not unhelpful. And so what can I learn from how I react? What can I learn from what they're saying, whether I agree with it or not? Which I think ties in a little bit to the sermon Gerald was giving recently about how do we stay present to each other, even across differences, and don't let that get in the way, but just be able to be present to each other in this moment. Some of my work is just doing a lot of listening, paying attention to where I'm reacting, and not making it about who's right or wrong, but paying attention to, why do I feel that way? Why do they feel that way? I wonder what their experiences were that caused them to get to that place. I wonder what shaped me that caused me to react that way. That's a big part of the early work, because most of us have been shaped by a particular type of narrative. When something disrupts that narrative, it's very easy to get into a defensive or frustrated or anxious space. And giving ourselves permission to move past that and to engage ourselves in a little bit of conversation, I think can be really, really liberating.
Something that I find that when people are talking about these issues and in discussion about them, something that brings discomfort that I think we have to ask ourselves about is our reactions to the some terms like white supremacy, for example, or white privilege. And when I was reading your book, by the way, folks, you got to get this book. It's called Pre-Post Racial America. And so when I was reading, there was a part in there, a phrase, this phrase, white privilege, can be a conversation ender. It's another phrase that people interpret in lots of different ways. And for sure, I know that we've seen it ourselves, that it elicits a lot of different emotions, yeah. White privilege and white supremacy. Could you help us unpack those terms? Mm-hmm. And what impact does it have for us in our church, which is largely white, and for those of us in the church who are people of color?
Yeah, so I was talking about how many of us are shaped by one dominant narrative. And that narrative includes what I sometimes call the myth of the level playing field. And so if we've been trained to believe that everyone gets the same start, then this notion of something like white privilege is going in the face of that narrative. So of course it's disruptive. Of course it throws us off a little bit. And we've also been shaped by a narrative of all or nothing. I told you I experienced some bullying when I came to this country, and I am very sympathetic to what was going on because we lived in we moved into a working class neighborhood with working class kids whose parents were doing worse than they had been 10 years ago, and who had heard the message over and over, that it was my family's fault. And because we've been trained into this, it's all or nothing. Either I win or I lose. And if I'm losing, you must be winning. I think that also creates some frustration, because I think a lot of people hear white privilege and they're like, but you don't know what I've been through. I have had to deal with so many things, and you're acting like my life is great. And so the terminology can throw people off, because the notion is there are winners and losers. And if you're using a term like privilege, it means you think I'm on top, and I know for a fact I'm not. There's a whole other story about, and I worked so hard for it. I'm not going to get into it now because we don't have enough time. There's an amazing article, it was written 10, 12 years ago, called Explaining White Privilege to a Broke White Person. Now, it has a curse word in the very first line, so I don't always use it in church settings, but the whole point is, yeah, you can have experienced a lot of challenges in your life, because sexism is real, and classism is real, and lack of educational access is real, and healthcare disparities are real. All of those things can be part of your experience, and you had all of these barriers, but one thing that wasn't a barrier was race. And because we live in these binary worlds of you win or you lose, if I'm struggling, then I can't have privilege, is an assumption of a binary, right? As opposed to, there are lots of different things that create our lived realities, and race is one of them. And so when we talk about white privilege, some people react to it badly because their sense is, you're telling me I'm doing great when I don't feel like I am, or you're telling me I'm bad when I know I'm a good person. And that's the other thing that I think is the challenge of that phrase, is privilege isn't actually a moral term. It's just a statement of reality. It's not something people need to be ashamed of or proud of. It's just a naming of a condition that then gives us information so we can decide how to change things so that there isn't as much of that privilege going on. But I think people feel personally shamed about it when it's actually a societal condition. And I spend a lot of time saying that the most important work that an organization or a faith community can do is develop shared language and shared definitions. Because when we use terms like racism, when we use terms like white privilege, when we use terms like classism, we don't have enough time to get into white supremacy, but when we use these terms and we mean different things by them, we talk past each other. And that's a lot of the challenges we have in the conversations we have about race.
Really good point. Shonda, can I ask you one other thing too? In my experience, it's been really, we've done, both at the church and other places that I have worked, have spent a lot of time talking about privilege. And this might be my experience, but I've noticed a lot of times people are very comfortable saying, oh, I know I have privilege because I'm a US citizen, or I have a really high degree of education, or even financially. Most often people can kind of accept, like, yes, I have those privileges, I'm really clear on that. But usually where I see kind of walls come up is when we talk about being white. So just an observation, don't know if you have anything to share on that.
And I think it's, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I often even find, and speaking with, men, often they can acknowledge some of their privilege they have as men too, more easily than being white.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's understandable, right? Because sociologists would say race is a construct. It's something that's created. We know that biologically, we actually have more in common across a number of races than sometimes within one race. It was constructed in a very specific way. And in the United States, going back about 400 years, in a very specific way for very specific reasons. And one of those reasons was to pit us against each other, right? There's Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 was a moment where white indentured servants and Black enslaved people were sent out by the plantation owners to drive off indigenous people. And they did that. And the reason they did it was because they had already been trained to see indigenous people as less than human. But in the midst of doing that work, they realized they had common cause. Enslavement and indentured servitude are very different things, but they did have a shared experience of, we are both treated very badly by the landed gentry, the plantation owners. And they realized in their common cause that they should rise up against the people who were causing them so much suffering. So Black enslaved folks, white indentured servants came together in Bacon's Rebellion. This is around the time that the quote unquote science of race begins to emerge in this country, to say, here's what white people are, and white people are superior to indigenous people, Asians, Black people. And here's what we mean by white, which is a very small group of people. But the reality of doing that was to create a wedge. You may be poor, but at least you're not Black. You may be poor, but at least you're an American. So the irony of it is, it concentrates power for this very small handful of people that almost none of us are, and creates conflict between us. Now the challenge is, a lot of white people are like, that's why there's just one race, the human race. That's why I don't believe in talking about race, because I think it divides us. Talking about race isn't what divides us. The reality that our laws and structures and even our Constitution has baked into it ways of privileging white people relative to people of color. A great example of that is, we finally got people to pay attention to anti-Asian violence. I know that's something this congregation cares a great deal about. And there are a lot of laws that are being put in place. Most of those laws actually hurt brown people, even though statistically, I think it is 98% of the anti-Asian hate crimes that have happened in this country that have been reported were by white people. But the laws, even when they don't mean to, are biased to protecting white people and to concentrating on over-policing communities of color. And so there's this irony that, even though I know a lot of white people who are really committed to ending anti-Asian violence, the actual laws that we're applying right now aren't actually addressing the problem and are actually making life harder for people of color. And so not talking about that doesn't make it go away. So I think that that's one of the challenges, is we think that not talking about race is how we create unity, but actually addressing policies that do harm to communities of color is actually how we address racism in our country.
You know, when you mentioned the anti-Asian hate, it reminded me of the term model minority. You were talking earlier too regarding wedges between groups of people. And that term model minority was basically used to drive wedges between the Asian community and particularly the Black community. Could you talk a little bit more about that? You know, the whole idea of—
Yeah, it's interesting, because in the late 1960s, and I don't want to romanticize it, it's, you know, everything's complicated, but in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Asian Americans were coming together and discovering that they could advocate for their rights. They had learned a lot from the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement and the Brown Berets. And so all of these communities that had experienced a great deal of marginalization were learning from each other and supporting each other and organizing together as well as individually. And in 1968, a white journalist used the term model minority, and he was specifically talking about Japanese Americans, but it very quickly became a term for all Asian Americans, to create a caricature that then we were pushed into, right, of the well-behaved minority, right, the ones who didn't cause trouble. And the thing about racism, that internalized racism, is I'm not the one to say to white folks, you know, you actually internalize a message of superiority, because I don't know very many white people who'd be willing to admit that. But what I can say is that for people of color, over the course of generations, when something is said to us over and over, we sometimes internalize that. So there is this message that is imposed on us that we swallow our pain, we behave well, we keep our heads down and don't cause disruption. And the irony is that term was created at a time that Asian Americans were being anything but quiet and well behaved. They were protesting, they were demanding an Asian studies program at San Francisco State, which still exists and which they keep fighting to protect. So that term was created at a time when Asian Americans were saying, we will not be dismissed, we will not be oppressed. The largest the largest labor organizing campaign ever up to that point in this country was the Chinese railroad workers. They organized a strike to demand fair payment because they knew they were being paid so much less than the white workers. There's a long history of Asians not being quiet and well behaved, but this narrative being imposed on us shuts down our ability to share the experiences we've actually had, because when we do, we're not behaving like proper Asians, right? Which was defined for us by someone outside of the community. In the same way that most of the stereotypes of various groups of color were not created by those groups themselves.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always think about too, when we talk about model minority, I have a number of cousins who are Asian, and, you know, they've shared during their childhood, especially one who really struggled in school, how hard school was because all these assumptions were made. And so I think one of the importance in many ways, talking about this kind of work and actually talking about it, is recognizing that while it may sound nice that you're a model minority, you know, even take an example of being in school every day and people making assumptions when really you struggle in school, and it adds on to your burden, and a deep experience of racism. So I think about, you know, these are really important things for us to talk about with young people too. And it's things we want to discuss with our kids, who are both, you know, white and people of color, to let them know, you know, it might sound really nice.
Right.
However, the experience is not, and can really be hurtful, and people carry it with them for a long time.
Yeah.
And it also erases that there are people in the community who are struggling, and that there are people in the community, especially refugee communities, who are not living the great life, right? I have Samoan friends who simultaneously get told they're part of the model minority and also get profiled by the police. And so we never talk about kind of the both and. I remember in high school, a kid ripping my math book out of my hands and saying, "Wait, why are you in regular math?" Because Asians are all supposed to be in advanced math class.
Yeah.
So some of it's about the boxes that we get put in, and nobody wants to live in a box.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You know, I flunked algebra twice. I hate to admit that, but I did. And I was never good at math.
Right.
Never good at math, you know. So Shonda, that the work of anti-oppression and anti-racism, it's always ongoing, but, you know, some people feel like, oh, you know, we've come so far. And I loved what you wrote about what your mom would always say to you. And I want to read this for our listening audience. She'd say, white people tend to look back and see how far we've come. People of color are daily reminded of how far we have to go. And I find that so profound, especially now in these days. I think we find this statement to be really true that, man, we're not as far as we think we are. And
Yeah.
help us unpack that a little bit. How is that playing out in our country?
Well, and I think that this is not the thing that makes me super popular in spiritual spaces, but I think a lot of it does actually go back to policies, and it goes back to who we're accountable to when we write our policies. I think there's a lot of intent versus impact that goes on in we want credit for our good intent without wanting to own what the impact of our actions is. And I think gosh, I'm doing a Bible study with a congregation right now on spiritualizing the 4 components of anti-racism. And there's an elder in that group who said, I'm here because I think it's important for our African-American elder. I think it's important for our church to have these conversations, and I'm always interested in our church having these conversations. And she said, but I don't see anything getting better. And in fact, I think things have gotten worse. And for people who love her in that congregation to hear her say that, I think had a significant impact, because they're like, look how far we've come, right? And what they mean is, look at how kind we are, look at how welcoming we are, look at how inclusive we are. And what she was saying is, look at how people have a harder time accessing the vote. Look at how many people are incarcerated. So she was talking about, look at these broad systemic issues, and they were saying, but look at how nice I am. And I think that that's the tension a little bit, especially when we know people who have been directly impacted by those policies. I think it makes it much more alive to us and much less hypothetical. And I think that we've been taught, especially in faith communities, that talking about things like policy disparities is political, and church is definitely not supposed to be political. And if we believe that, then the challenge we face is we never get to talk about the stuff that's impacting people's daily lives. We spend 80% of our time on the interpersonal stuff, but 80% of the impact is policies. And we've written ourselves out of doing the healing and justice making work that really has an impact, that has the most significant impact. Again, not necessarily something that makes me super popular in church settings. It's why it's really fun to work with corporations, because they're like, okay, how do we implement that? How do we institutionalize it? What are the HR practices? Ironically, easier to do in a for-profit corporation sometimes than in spiritual communities, where we're like, but we're so nice. And that's what should matter, because Jesus taught us to love each other. The interesting thing is, Jesus also invested himself in policy. You know, people say that when he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and render unto God what is God's, that he was saying, don't worry yourself with money. What he was saying is, the empire is a lie. Why are you investing in the system of Rome when you should be investing yourself in a liberative community of God? None of this belongs to Caesar. I mean, he was advocating for nonviolent rebellion, arguably nonviolent revolution. But we've been trained to see it as, don't trouble yourself with those things, when I'm not convinced that's actually what he was saying at all.
So Shonda, building on that a little bit, people may not know this about your background, but you and I both have policy degrees that we did at the University of Chicago. So I think a lot of your work, along with being a pastor, you really understand how to take faith and turn it into practice in a way that a lot of people wouldn't. So I think when we talk about, you know, I've had a lot of experience over the years that people say, I would love to know how to change scriptures. I would love to know how to make these changes. And I can see, you know, how this happens. I worked on one law change. It's probably been 10 years ago in the state of California, and it was around human trafficking. And what was happening is that any young woman who was trafficked would also get prostitution charges.
Yep.
Right. So this is a really great example of how policy can hurt somebody.
Yeah.
The reality is those young women were trafficked. Right. And so we worked on a law that said that if you were trafficked, you cannot be charged with prostitution. Right. So these young women being trafficked are charged with, I mean, going to jail. They have criminal records. And you're like, these are people who, were brought in maybe from our own communities who were trafficked or from around the globe. And now they're in a country, they don't know the language, or they're, again, people from communities that we live in who've been trafficked. That's a really clear, simple example of a policy that was really broken. And in those conversations, I remember someone said, well, what if one person is, what if some people are prostitutes? And the question a number of us asked is, okay, well, if you have 100 people who've been trafficked, and maybe one of them actually is doing sex work for pay by choice, although I would really argue that not many people do it by choice, but that's another podcast, perhaps. That would be an example of when that law was changed, it protected people and protected girls and women and even boys and men who were trafficked without a criminal record. And I think most people, minus a few at the table with us, were like, well, that just makes sense. Yeah. How much, what kinds of things do you think churches and people who are at the point where they say, I want to make a change, I don't know how to do this work, I don't know how to get involved, I don't know what good policy is. What are your recommendations for people who are ready to jump in and be part of it?
So this is super lazy on my part, but yeah, even though I'm deeply passionate about policy, I also know the power of stories. Like, we can have as much data as we want, but it really is the experience of knowing someone's story that often gets us involved in the work. So I love Jasmine Tarkoff from Multi-Faith Action Coalition. She's also a member of, help me out,
Temple
Isaiah. And so Multi-Faith Action Coalition in their early, which is in y'all's territory, when they first got off the ground, they had a program very focused on helping people get access to WIC, to food programs for people who didn't earn enough money to be able to pay for all of their groceries. And she was so passionate about this program because they were under enrolled. There were not very many people who were signed up for the Contra Costa version of, and it wasn't WIC, I'm trying to remember what it was, but a food service program for low income people. And so she made it her goal to take people to the county service office and sign them up because this under enrollment was the problem. And then when she went with somebody to the county services office and realized how humiliating and demeaning and arbitrary the process was, she found herself saying, oh, I might rather go hungry than go through this. And she realized then, as she talked with other people who explained, I had to give up a day's pay to go through this process, and I still didn't get what I needed, and here's how I was treated, and all of those things. She realized that they needed to shift their focus to, how do we run this program so that it has dignity, not just how do we enroll more people in it. Because the reason it's under enrolled is because people feel crummy about themselves in the midst of that process. And so I think that there are moments where we have those relational experiences that help all of those numbers make sense, because then we realize, oh, all of those numbers are human beings. That's been my experience with work to change the criminal justice system. Is I've seen what the conditions are like and the experiences are like for people who are in jail and prison, and how little chance they have of being able to create a different life for themselves. And we can do better than that. And together we can figure out how to do that. So Multi-Faith Action Coalition is a great way to plug in, because they're connected with real people as well as some good policy analysis. And also, I'm on the board of East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, which has an office in Concord at Ignacio Valley Presbyterian Church. And they're doing tenant organizing and immigration justice and worker justice issues alongside tenants and immigrants and workers. So in the course of building up relationships and hearing stories and getting a fuller picture of the issues in our community, being informed by the people living the things, I think makes a big difference. Yeah. So those are there are easy starting places if you live in Contra Costa.
You bet. Thank you.
You know, I'm so sorry we're coming to the
we're over
close
time,
of our time, but we're going to have a chapter 2
I agree.
Yeah. But before we close, Shonda, would you be kind enough to read from your book for us this morning as our closing exercise?
Absolutely. So in the midst, we were talking about joy and justice, and in the midst of all the hard work that so many people I love are doing, I realized there weren't a lot of devotional resources to encourage people as they do the work of justice, as they explore a deeper relationship with a very loving God in the midst of all of the hard things we're all going through. And so I wrote Liberating Love as a collection of devotions that help us connect with our spiritual ancestors from every single book in the Bible and are written as if they are directly from God to you. So I'm going to kind of randomly choose one from July 2nd. It's from Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. I'll read you the scripture and then the love note from God. So the scripture is, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. The only thing I want to learn from you is this. Did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard?" And here's the love note from God. "There is a saying among young activists today, your respectability will not save you. What they mean is if the state has decided your group of people is dangerous, then your safety is at risk no matter how well behaved you are. The same was true for my early followers. You know that I have said that your actions reflect your beliefs, but Paul was conveying to those early Christians that they had witnessed the profound faithfulness of my son in the face of state violence. And if that had not changed their hearts, then their actions meant nothing. Today, I invite you to pay attention to where my spirit is whispering in your ear, that you might believe and be comforted." Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Shonda, for being with us. And we're so grateful for you. And we're grateful for the work that you've been doing and continue to do. And you inspire us here at LLPC for sure.
Likewise, friends.
And to those of you who are watching this this video recording, thank you for joining us. And please be sure you watch some of the other talking story videos that we've done in the past. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.